Why do people panic when an empath detaches emotionally? Not get angry, not argue, not fight back, but quietly, completely and without warning, detaches. Carl Jung believed that the most destabilizing force in any relationship is not conflict. It's the sudden disappearance of emotional supply. And nowhere is this more terrifying than when it happens with an empath. Because when an empath detaches emotionally, something ancient inside the other person begins to unravel. Most people misunderstand this moment. They assume the empath is being dramatic, cold, or vindictive. But Jung discovered that emotional detachment in empaths is not an act of aggression. It is an act of perception. And once perception changes, the old dynamic can never be restored. Here's what Jung understood that most people never realize until it's too late. Empaths don't bond the way others do. They don't connect through power or control. They connect through emotional attunement. They regulate the emotional climate of relationships without anyone ever noticing. They soften tension. They absorb discomfort. They translate pain into understanding. They create psychological safety simply by being present. And because of this, many people unconsciously outsource their emotional stability to the empath. They don't know they're doing it, but they rely on the empath's availability to feel grounded, validated, forgiven, or important. Jung would call this an unconscious dependency. The other person's emotional equilibrium quietly rests on the empath's willingness to stay engaged. This is why detachment causes panic, because when the empath pulls away emotionally, the other person isn't just losing a relationship. They're losing regulation. They're losing the mirror that helped them feel okay about who they were. They're losing the buffer that absorbed their chaos and made it manageable. And suddenly, they are alone with themselves. Carl Jung observed that the psyche reacts violently when a long-standing compensation disappears. When something has been unconsciously relied upon for stability, its absence triggers anxiety, confusion, and fear. This is exactly what happens when an empath detaches emotionally. The panic isn't about losing the empath, it's about facing what the empath was quietly holding together. Here's the part most people don't want to admit. Many individuals don't love empaths for who they are. They love them for how they feel when the empath is around. They love the patience, the forgiveness, the emotional labor, the understanding that has no expiration date. So when that emotional access is withdrawn, the illusion collapses. Jung referred to this as the collapse of projection. The moment when someone can no longer project their unmet needs, wounds, or self-image onto another person. When the empath detaches, the projection has nowhere to land, and what rushes back is discomfort. That discomfort quickly turns into panic. You'll notice something interesting happens at this stage. The same person who once took the empath for granted suddenly becomes frantic. They start reaching out, explaining themselves, apologizing, rewriting history, or sometimes attacking, blaming, and accusing the empath of being cruel or heartless. This reaction is not about reconciliation, it's about restoration of control, because emotional detachment removes leverage. Carl Jung warned that emotional influence is the most powerful form of control in human relationships. Not dominance, not authority. Emotional access. When an empath is emotionally available, they can be persuaded, guilted, reasoned with, or emotionally pulled back into old patterns. But when that access disappears, the tools stop working. The guilt no longer lands, the tears no longer move them, the explanations feel unnecessary, and this is when panic sets in. The other person realizes, often subconsciously, that they no longer have a psychological grip on the empath. The empath is no longer emotionally reactive, no longer explaining, no longer trying to be understood. Jung described this state as psychological autonomy. And to someone who relied on emotional access, autonomy feels like abandonment. But here's the truth Jung uncovered. Emotional detachment in empaths is not rejection, it's integration. For most of their lives, empaths suppress an essential part of themselves, the part that sets limits, the part that withdraws when harmed, the part that chooses silence over self-betrayal. Jung called this the shadow. And for empaths, the shadow is not cruelty, it is self-protection. When an empath finally integrates this shadow, they stop over-functioning emotionally. They stopped compensating for others. They stopped carrying what was never theirs. And that integration is irreversible. This is why people panic. Because they sense correctly that something fundamental has changed. The empath is no longer negotiating their worth through care. They're no longer available to fix, soothe, or absorb. They are present, but not accessible. And this distinction is terrifying to those who depended on access. You'll often hear people say things like, "You've changed," or "You're not the same person anymore." Jung would say, they're right, because the empath has individuated. They separated their identity from the role they were unconsciously playing. And once individuation occurs, regression is psychologically impossible without self-violence. Another reason panic emerges is because emotional detachment removes predictability. Empaths are predictable when they care. They respond. They explain. They forgive. They stay longer than they should. Their patterns are consistent. Detachment disrupts this. The empath no longer reacts on cue, no longer responds emotionally, no longer reassures, no longer proves their love through endurance. And unpredictability triggers fear. Jung noted that the ego fears what it cannot control or anticipate. When the empath becomes emotionally unavailable, the familiar emotional feedback loop disappears. The other person doesn't know how to behave anymore. Their old strategies fail, so they escalate. They may try affection, then guilt, then anger, then nostalgia, all attempts to re-establish emotional access. But the empath sees this clearly now, because detachment brings clarity. Without emotional entanglement, the empath can observe patterns instead of participating in them. They recognize manipulation without hatred, neediness without contempt, dependency without responsibility, and this calm observation feels threatening to those who thrived on emotional chaos. Carl Jung emphasized that true power is quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't justify itself. It doesn't need agreement. Emotional detachment places the empath in this position. They are no longer invested in outcomes that require self-betrayal, and that is why panic escalates into desperation. Some people will accuse the empath of being narcissistic, selfish, or emotionally dead. But Jung would call this projection. The discomfort they feel is being externalized, because facing the truth would require confronting how much they took without giving. Detachment forces accountability, and accountability terrifies those who benefited from imbalance. Here is the final and most unsettling reason people panic when an empath detaches emotionally. They sense that the empath is no longer emotionally reachable, not temporarily, not situationally, but fundamentally. The empath is no longer seeking connection at the cost of self-respect. Jung referred to this as psychological completion, the point where a person no longer needs external validation to maintain their sense of self. And when this happens, emotional manipulation becomes impossible. The empath doesn't need closure. They don't need apologies. They don't need explanations. They understand. And understanding removes hooks. This is why the detachment feels final, because it is. Not because the empath is punishing anyone, but because they are no longer willing to abandon themselves to preserve connection. People panic because they realize something precious has been lost. Not love, not affection. Access. Access to someone who made emotional life easier by carrying more than their share. And once that access is gone, it cannot be negotiated back. Carl Jung believed that every psyche must eventually choose between comfort and truth. Empaths delay this choice longer than most. But when they finally choose truth, the ground shifts beneath everyone involved. The empath doesn't walk away loudly. They don't announce their departure. They don't seek validation for leaving. They simply stop participating, and in that silence, others finally hear the echo of what they lost. Not an empath's love, but an empath's presence. And once that presence is withdrawn, panic is inevitable.